Thank you very much. I hope that you all enjoyed dinner, and shh. That works. I've never gotten to do that before. So anyway, hope you enjoyed your dinner, and I'm very excited to introduce the next section of the program. We are going to have Georgetown Law's Professor Randy Barnett, Reason's very own Nick Gillespie, and if the internet gods allow it to happen, via Skype, we will have Harvard University professor Alan Dershowitz. They are going to be talking about the Constitution in the Trump era. So please join me in welcoming Nick and Randy to the stage and Alan to the screen.
Thanks. We're going to wait a second, see if, oh, there is Alan Dershowitz. Can we get Alan on the front monitor as well? Anyone? All right, I guess not. So we're going to talk for about 20 minutes, have a conversation about the Constitution in the Trump era. And let's get right to it. Gentlemen, and I'll go to Alan first and then Randy, you. Does Donald Trump represent a uniquely serious challenge to constitutional government? This is what we're getting more and more. If he does, what's his most egregious behavior? And if he doesn't, why are people freaking out about it?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me by Skype. I wish I could be there. Look, I'm old enough to remember so many crises in history that people said were unique and were never going to recur again. I was just a child when Franklin Delano Roosevelt ordered the detention of 110,000 Americans of Japanese descent in detention centers. I lived through McCarthyism when I was a college student and fought against it as a college student. I lived through and represented many people who were caught up in the Vietnam movement, where we had extreme violence. Students were blowing up universities and targeting police and soldiers to kill. You know, I lived through, as we all did, 9/11, and this is yet another challenge to our Constitution. Donald Trump does put challenges to our Constitution. He seems less sympathetic to many of the values of the Constitution than many of us in this room are, but our system of checks and balances is working effectively. It's being tested, but it's working effectively. And we have an ultimate check and balance on an executive, and that is impeachment. We have presidents, both wrongly, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton, and we almost impeached one president rightly, Richard Nixon. He committed impeachable offenses, obstruction of justice, destroying evidence, telling his people to lie, paying hush money to potential witnesses not to testify.
So, Alan, this sounds like a good time to mention your forthcoming book. Because, you know, among other things, he doesn't just protect the Constitution, he's always pushing product as well. What is your forthcoming book called?
It's called The Case Against the Democratic House Impeaching Donald Trump. It is.
So it sounds like your answer, and let's go to
run up
Randy.
to the election, because I realized that there would be efforts once the Democrats took over the House by at least some on the radical left to try to impeach the president. There's a lead article in today's Atlantic Monthly with a cover story with big bold letters saying impeach, and the basic thesis of the argument is that to safeguard the Constitution from Trump, we should violate the Constitution and impeach him, even though the constitutional criteria for impeachment haven't been met. That would be a disaster, because presidents last only 4 or 8 years, but bad precedents endure forever, and we should not be violating the Constitution in an effort to be rid of a president that many people don't like and will have an opportunity, presumably, to vote against.
I feel like I'm in the fifth term of the George W. Bush government. Am I wrong about that, Randy? No, but is Trump uniquely a threat to the Constitution?
Now, the answer to that is flat out no.
But is it good for the Constitution then?
I think the answer to that is yes. If it hadn't been for this last election, after 8 years of Democratic nominations to the courts at all levels, if a Democrat had won, whatever Democrat it was, and in this case it was Hillary Clinton, I was prepared to leave constitutional law as a subject matter, having devoted 25 years to it, and return to the subject of contract law, which is what I taught before I was a con law professor, because with 16 years, 12 or 16 years of Democratic appointments to the judiciary, there would be no hope whatsoever to restore the original meaning of the Constitution. Period, end of story, game over. That was the end. We dodged that bullet.
That is an overstatement, isn't it?
I think
No.
so.
Yeah, well, Alan, you think it's an overstatement?
I do. I think that, the Democratic nominees to the court have been of a variety of backgrounds. Steve Breyer yesterday voted with the majority to allow criminal penalties to be imposed on somebody who stole a purse, saying that was a crime of violence. The people who were appointed by Bill Clinton voted against him when it came to matters of importance to his administration. I don't think the judiciary has been destroying the Constitution. Look,
I disagreed with Alan Dershowitz when he was my professor at Harvard Law School. I'm very used to that. I disagree with him about this as well. Since the New Deal, we had a bipartisan commitment to a living Constitution that was shared by both Republicans and Democrats. And it's only been since Ronald Reagan was elected and Ed Meese was Attorney General that we began to have an interest in originalism, that is, protecting and restoring the original meaning of the text of the Constitution. And it really, but in the Bush administration, the nominees that they chose screened out originalists, screened out libertarians in favor of more traditional restraint conservatives. It's only been in the Trump administration that we've had a justice like Justice Gorsuch, who is a committed originalist, that gets nominated to the court. And we have judges all the way up and down the system who are also originalists. And so there's two parts of this. One is what 16 years of Democratic nominations would have meant for the future of the court. And the other is the potential upside of the nominees that we've been seeing for the last 2 years. The uncertainty is with a new White House counsel, and White House counsel has a lot to do with who gets picked. With a new White House counsel now, who we don't know as well as Don McGahn, the White House counsel that's leaving, we don't know if the nominees that we're going to get over the next 2 years are going to equal the nominees we had over the past 2 years. But for 2 years, this has been a very, very desirable situation for anyone who cares about the text of the Constitution.
Look, we have to give credit where credit is due. First of all, Randy Barnett was one of the originators of the move toward originalism. Justice Scalia largely borrowed from Barnett. Barnett has done an amazing job in bringing originalism back to the forefront, not only in academic debates, but in judicial appointments. My own view, when I debated Justice Scalia, who was a friend and a colleague and somebody who I disagreed with a lot but liked, the argument, is this a dead Constitution or a living Constitution? The answer is yes. It's both. There are provisions in the Constitution that are clearly dead. You have to be 35 to be president. There's no way of being creative or non-originalist about that. But when you have phrases like the equal protection of the law and the due process of the law and cruel and unusual punishment and equal protection, those cry out for interpretation. And if you're going to interpret the Constitution, and the framers had no idea how we would be dealing with these issues, or should be dealing. Let me give you one example: segregated schools. There's no question that the 14th Amendment was enacted by people who believed strongly in segregated schools. They would be turning over in their graves if they believed that they had voted to integrate schools.
It's just not true.
And yet it's unthinkable that in 1954 we would allow segregation to continue. Let me ask you, Randy, you really think that the people who voted
Absolutely.
for the 14th Amendment believe that schools should be integrated and that black people should be able to marry white people?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Give him a chance to answer.
The congressman that voted for the 14th Amendment also voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And a majority of congressmen in both the House and the Senate voted for a provision that would have desegregated the schools. The reason why it didn't become part of the Civil Rights Act of 1875 is because at that point there were filibuster rules in both the House and the Senate, and they needed a supermajority that they never were able to acquire. But the support for that provision was virtually 100% of the people that voted for the 14th Amendment voted in favor of that constitutional amendment. It was the Democrats and a few others that opposed it.
Why did it take so long?
Yeah.
Why it took so long is because there was a lot of racism in the country. There's no doubt about that. You can be both a racist and still believe in equal rights. That has been established.
That's strange to me. I've never met a racist who believes in equal rights. Maybe you have. I never have.
Well, you got to get out more, Alan. You got to get out more.
I got to meet
Alan,
more racists, right?
Let me ask you, you've written very, and spoken out against the Mueller investigation, and also the ACLU, you think is really trying to push the country into an impeachment scenario. What is, why do you think they're doing that? What's going on there? And does that present a challenge to kind of America as a country?
Look, the ACLU is now part of the problem, not part of the solution. It doesn't care about civil liberties. It doesn't care about free speech. It cares only about money and partisan politics. It went from a $30 million budget to a $130 million budget after Donald Trump got elected because it realized that it could raise all this money by saying, we'll do anything to get Trump without concern for civil liberties. Can you imagine the old ACLU, when I was on the national board, applauding the search of a lawyer's office without separating out lawyer-client privileged information from unprivileged information? That's what the ACLU did. The ACLU has forgotten about free speech on university campuses. It's forgotten about due process when it comes to students who are being disciplined for alleged sexual assault.
And you think that's just a money gambit? They're in it for the buck.
Money drives it, but I think the reason money drives it is because the members of the ACLU have now become synonymous with the members of Move On. Radical left politics trumps over anything resembling civil liberties. And I think we need a new civil liberties organization that genuinely believes in civil liberties for all in a nonpartisan way. The ACLU has abandoned that task, which is why I've had to pick up the slack in many ways and become the liberal civil libertarian Democrat who stands up for the civil liberties of Donald Trump and everybody else who risks having their civil liberties taken away from them.
And another mark on behalf of the Trump administration is that they have intervened in these free speech cases on campus and made it a point to, and filed and become parties of interest supporting the free speech position on campus is something that the Obama administration would never have done, and the Clinton administration would never do.
Is there anything that Trump or his administration is doing that bothers you from a kind of constitutional point of view?
Not from a constitutional point of view.
So then what are the things that...
Well, there'd be policy disagreements like I would have with any Republican administration. Probably fewer with this Republican administration than previous ones, but we would just have to go to those areas. But constitutionally, I agree with Alan. I mean, whatever the views of the president are with respect to the Constitution, and I don't claim that he's a constitutional scholar, but then again, we just had a constitutional law teacher as the president, and his views on the Constitution were not the kind that I would think were great either. And so the one thing about Donald Trump is that he has picked good legal advisors and he's followed their advice. And whatever instincts he may have had and whatever ideas he tweets about, he doesn't actually effectuate those as policy because the administration he's picked has advised him against doing it and he's followed their advice for 2 years.
You must be very happy that Jeff Sessions is gone? I mean, I realize now he's living in your spare bedroom, but I mean, it's like besides that.
Look, I disagree with Jeff Sessions on policy grounds on two very important policy issues. One is his enthusiastic support for civil asset forfeiture, and the other is his views on marijuana and other drug policies, but in particular marijuana policy. That's a policy disagreement, but Jeff Sessions is a good and honorable person who ran the Department of Justice in an impartial manner, and his attitude towards the Mueller investigation is a good example of that. And one policy after another that's been implemented by him, including their intervention on the part of free speech. Jeff Sessions came to Georgetown Law and gave an address, chose to come to Georgetown Law and give an address on the importance of campus free speech, facing protesters at Georgetown Law, because that was important to Jeff Sessions. So I don't think that I never made Jeff Sessions into a bogeyman. I think it's a mistake for libertarians to do that.
I think you understate the disaster that President Obama was when it came to civil liberties on college campuses. In addition to not caring much about free speech on college campus, he made universities, private universities, made them deny due process to people students who were charged with sexual assaults. He made them lower the standard from clear and convincing evidence to proof by a preponderance. And he threatened them and said, if you don't do it, we'll take all the money away from your medical schools.
And he made them do this with dear colleague letters, which were not appropriately enacted regulations. They were not laws. They were not enacted by Congress. They are not regulations enacted through the regulatory process. They are letters unilaterally issued by the president to the campuses in order to coerce them. And the Department of Justice under Jeff Sessions has done away with these dear colleague letters and revoked them one after the other. It's very hard for me to get upset about that.
Credit is due. I think the Trump administration deserves enormous credit for rescinding some of these horrible restrictions on free speech and due process on university campuses. But look, I'm critical of President Trump threatening to withdraw security clearances based on political considerations. I'm upset with him for attacking the media in the way that he does it, and for using demeaning language that divides the country even more. But I tend to agree with you on the Constitution. I'm hard-pressed to find areas where he has violated the Constitution. I don't know the Emoluments Clause well enough to conclude about that, but certainly, even if that were to have been violated, it would not be a ground for impeachment, because it's not a crime.
Tell us a little bit about how you became, or how you were introduced to libertarian ideas. You know, part of it is Randy was your student, and he was busting your chops all the time in class. Only a few years ago, really. But also, you encountered a couple of luminaries in a kind of libertarian intellectual world. What was going on there?
In addition to Randy Barnett, who was really a great student, I love to have students who disagreed with me, and Randy was paramount among them, and I always learned from him in the class. I used to judge my classes not for how well I taught, but for how much I learned from students, and Randy was fantastic in that respect. I was very lucky as an 18-year-old kid to mistakenly enroll in a course called ethics. I grew up in Brooklyn, and I thought ethics meant kind of being polite to people, and I needed to learn a little bit about that because I was a street kid. And when I entered this class called ethics, I encountered a man named John Hospers, who was professor of philosophy at Brooklyn College. Ultimately, he went to California schools, became the libertarian candidate for president of the United States. But John Hospers taught me, A, the Socratic method, and B, he taught me really about libertarianism. I think of myself as a civil libertarian because I place less emphasis personally on economic liberty than I do on other kinds of personal liberties. I'm not one of those who believes that unless you have full economic liberty, you can't have political liberty. I like economic liberty. I'm a free market person, but my priorities are in favor of due process and free speech, which is why I call myself civil libertarian.
Thank you.
And you knew Bob Nozick as well, right, Alan?
Bob was one of my closest friends, and even in his book, he credits me in his book State, Anarchy, and Utopia. And we spent, the year he wrote that book, we were together at the Center for Advanced Study Behavioral Sciences, and Bob was one of my closest friends in the world. And so inevitably, his libertarianism would have to rub off on me. We had arguments and fights, and by the end of his life, he had kind of moved away from strict libertarianism and was kind of searching for a left-wing libertarianism, a more distributive egalitarianism that also encompassed libertarianism. It was a hard task, and I think he struggled toward the end with the intellectual purity of his positions.
And I got to know Bob when I was a law student at Harvard, and he was very good to me. As a lowly Harvard law student, he was very, very generous to me as well.
He was a wonderful man.
He wore a lot of turtlenecks too. Right?
He loved
This was,
turtlenecks.
I think that's the difference between a right wing and a left wing.
He was a cool. He was.
Bow ties versus
He
turtlenecks.
was a cool cat before you were a cool
okay,
cat, Nick.
very
He was
good,
like the
very
Nick Gillespie of Harvard philosophy
he
department.
he was like that. I think of that often. I write that often.
When I first met Bob, he wore slouchy suits and baggy pants, and it's really about when he met his second wife, Trudy. She really dressed him up and made him into the kind of suave guy he ultimately became.
So let's go back to the question about Trump on the judiciary. Well, first off, how do you guys feel about the person who's likely to become the next Attorney General? Randy, why don't you weigh in first?
Next Attorney General? Oh,
Yeah.
Bill Barr?
Yeah.
Well, I was on a program with Bill Barr. It was a program at the University of Kansas. It was a Bill Koch conference that was held there on criminal justice. And he was a pretty hardcore drug warrior back then. And so I don't know whether he's mellowed at all, but I would expect maybe something like that
But
from him
is the
today.
Attorney General, I mean, certainly isn't as important as something like a Supreme Court judge or even a Circuit Court judge?
It's very important, but again, policies, they come and go. And lifetime tenured judicial appointments, they extend beyond the lifetime of a particular president. That's why I focus on that, because that is what's going to be of lasting significance, and which could have gone terribly, horribly wrong if we didn't have this spate of appointments. With respect to policies, even the ones I like, the problem is that because many of them are being done by executive decision making, because the Congress is not functioning, they can be undone the next time you have a change in power. So I like good policies as long as they're there, but then along comes the next one and they'll be changed. One problem with changing the policies in a good direction now is we have lower court judges who are appointed by other presidents who are obstructing that by issuing nationwide injunctions against those policy changes. Policy changes that were made by executives in the past are now being restricted when the new executive comes in, and elections should have consequences, and these judges are preventing that from happening.
Look, the best example of the abuse of executive authority was President Obama's signing of the Iran nuclear deal. The vast majority of Americans were opposed to it. The vast majority of senators were opposed to it. The vast majority of members of Congress were opposed to it. And yet the president signed it, even though it took the form essentially of a treaty, and the Constitution requires 2/3 for a treaty. But when he signed it, he knew that the next president could abrogate it, and the next president rightfully did abrogate it. I don't like executive actions. They've been part of our system of governance for the last probably almost 70 or 80 years, and I think it does undercut the role of Congress. But as Randy says, when Congress is not acting, how do you solve these problems? I want to throw out to Randy a problem of constitutionality. What would you do to solve the closing of the government problem? The Congress can't do it alone. The president doesn't want to do it. I think we all have to admit it's not consistent with the spirit of our Constitution to have the government closed and to have employees of the government not being paid. How, in a constitutional way, would you end this impasse?
By the way, you just completely lost the room, but please continue. Randy?
I don't understand why you say Congress can't do it. All they have to do is pass a bill in which they do it. All they have to do is make a deal with the Republican president, which they don't seem to want to do. So I don't understand why Congress can't just pass a bill. They can pass a bill tomorrow to open up the government.
Well, and the president can end the shutdown completely if he withdraws his demand for $5 billion wall. So you can't say Congress can do it or the president can do it. Either can stop the other one from doing it.
But Congress could do it. I mean, Congress can pass a budget statement and then pass it over his veto. I mean, it's really Congress is the problem here.
But you say pass it over his veto. That
Well, I'm saying that, I mean, the reason why the government is shut down is because there's not a budget or a spending authority. That's, the House and the Senate can pass legislation and then pass it over.
Look, the part of the original Constitution that we still have is a separation of powers between a legislative and executive. And the part of the Constitution that is still adhered to according to its original meaning is the fact that the Congress has to pass the law and the president must concur or be overridden. And that's what's causing the current gridlock. But gridlock was built into the system by the founders who wanted to see, first of all, they wanted to make it harder to pass legislation, although that also makes it harder to pass repeals as well as enacting in the first place. But secondly, they wanted people to have to come together. They want diverse interests or factions to have to work together. And what we have now is a situation where the political bases of both parties are not letting their leaders, to the extent their leaders have any inclination to do so, work together with each other because they're demanding fealty all the way up and down the line.
The frame Constitution certainly did not have in mind the closure of the government as a partisan effort on both parts.
They did not have in mind the opening of the government to the extent we have it today, that's for sure.
It depends on how you define the government. When you define the government, you include security guards at airports and Federal Aviation Administration officials and Federal Food Health Administration's officials. I do think that they saw the role of government in protecting the rights of individuals to be safe. And right now we're seeing that placed in jeopardy by extreme partisan politics on both sides. And I don't think the framers had in mind the sanction of closing down the government as a way of trying to bring people together and eliminate factions. I think this is a failure of governance on the part of both parties and frankly on the part of the Constitution.
Let's zoom out a little bit because we're talking about the Constitution in the Trump era. Alan, what is, regardless of Trump, but right now in the current moment and looking down the road 5 or 10 years, what do you think is the biggest constitutional issue or problem, kind of a miasma that you see screwing things up? Like what should we be focused on as a major threat that we need to kind of work through?
Well, I think the brilliance of the Constitution is that it allows to solve problems that we couldn't possibly have anticipated. And, the Talmud says that prophecy ended with the destruction of the Second Temple, and I'm not going to try to prophesy what's going to be the great problems 10 years from now. I can give you one or two that I think will daunt our constitutional system, namely the Internet and the monopoly that some of the Internet providers and Facebook and Twitter and all the others, the framers of our Constitution who had in mind common sense that sold for a nickel, or newspapers that were printed on printing presses, couldn't have contemplated what the challenges to the First Amendment would look like with the development of the social networks. And so I think the courts are going to have a very difficult time dealing with issues of that kind as we move forward 15, 20, or 25 years. But years ago, we couldn't have anticipated what we see today, so I'm not sure we can anticipate what we see.
Do you feel, that Google or Apple or Amazon or Facebook, Twitter, that they have effective monopolies on speech? Or haven't they created platforms where people are freer than ever to kind of express themselves or go elsewhere?
A little of both. I think there's a little of both. You can't go absolutely elsewhere. You have to go to one of those social platforms. And those social platforms, I would think conservatives would be particularly concerned because it is alleged, and I think with some truth, that the social media tend to favor the left over the right and tend to censor more the right than the left. I was in YouTube, I did a thing for Dennis Prager talking about how Israel was established and how it was established by law and is a legitimate country. And they YouTube took it down and said that it wasn't appropriate for young people to watch.
You were naked in it, so there's that. But did they actually?
For anybody to watch.
Did they take it down or did they demonetize it?
No, what they did is they said that young people couldn't watch it. It was restricted above a certain age. I don't know the technicalities. There is a lawsuit pending. Dennis Prager's people are bringing the lawsuit. I'm not part of the lawsuit, but I'm a subject of the lawsuit because it's one of my lectures that was being subject to scrutiny of a kind that wouldn't have been subject if it had been an argument made by the left.
Randy, what large question or area are you concerned about?
The national surveillance state. It's a problem that we've had through. The reason why it's such a big problem is it's a bipartisan problem. Both parties support it. And they really shouldn't. And we have the massive bulk data collection. We have a few individual politicians like Rand Paul who see this problem. I will say this, though, which is on a hopeful note. I've spoken to a number of the justices about what they view as the things that they need the most help with respect to, for example, the original meaning of the text of the Constitution. And to a person, individually, talking to them separately, it's the Fourth and Fifth Amendments that they think is being placed most under stress now, and which the Supreme Court's current doctrine does not adequately address at present. And so there's actually a supermajority of justices on both sides who are dissatisfied with how the Supreme Court is currently handling Fourth Amendment questions with respect to personal privacy.
If only they knew people on the Supreme Court that could rule differently. Right?
Well, you know, Randy, you may remember when you were in my class 150 years ago, the class was called Prediction and Prevention of Harmful Conduct, and I coined the term the preventive state when I was doing writing in that class. And part of the preventive state is, of course, the state that intrudes into every aspect of life in order to prevent harm and prevent violence. On the one hand, we want to prevent harm and prevent violence if we can do it. On the other hand, the costs to liberty may be so great that the effort is counterproductive. So this is a problem that goes back at least to the time you were in my class, and it's a problem that I agree with you will continue.
Thank you, Alan Dershowitz. Thank you, Randy Barnett. That's going to be the last word. We'll leave it there. Thank you, Students for Liberty, for all you do. Please give Wolf and his whole gang another hand of applause, please. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I'd like to take a minute now and recognize some of the sponsors that have helped make this amazing night tonight happen. They're all listed in your program. I'm not going to read all of them, but I do want to highlight just a few. And I'm going to read them to make sure I don't actually miss anyone. I want to thank two sponsors in particular, Reason and LGBTQ for Liberty. And a special thanks to our host committee, which includes Dale Bottoms, Chase Investment Counsel Corporation of Charlottesville, the Consumer Choice Center, David Don, Cynthia and Peter Gettler, Ethel May Humphreys, John Mackey, the one and only Jerry Orstrom, the American Conservative, and Kevin Yarko. And Dan Grossman. Now, I'm really excited to introduce Steve Forbes as our next speaker. I've known Steve for, well, more years than I will admit to. But once we were having a very contentious board meeting, and Steve wasn't able to be there in person, but he called in, and the speaker phone was connected to the speakers in the conference room. So suddenly, Steve was the voice of God. And I have to tell you, when Steve is on your side, and he's the voice of God, you know that it's going to be okay. So I'm very excited to introduce Steve. He will be giving tonight's Toast to Liberty. So please join me in welcoming Steve Forbes.
Voice of God. We have 5 teenage daughters, had 5 teenage daughters. They're thankfully out of those years. And being referred to as God, I'm not sure they would have used those words back then, except as a add-on to other things, like I'm not going to mention here tonight. And by the way, those of you who are younger, when you have kids and you take them through the teen years, just remember what Abraham Lincoln said under very different circumstances: this too shall pass. So, and another thing, before we get to the toast to our young people, when you become parents, my father liked to say, you know you're a successful parent when you become an embarrassment to your children. So keep that in mind. But I'm honored tonight to be able to give this toast for liberty, the Students for Liberty. The fruits of your work are both visible today and enduring for the future. You saw that with the awards tonight. You confront challenges to liberty while effectively advocating principles that change people's minds. Too often, the media likes to portray socialism and increasingly suffocating big government paternalism as historically inevitable. You are courageously saying no, while making the case, both intellectually and through your activities, that it is only through liberty that people progress. You are the true progressives, while the leftists are most accurately described by David Rubin and others as the regressives. They may be young chronologically, but by golly, they are dinosaurs when it comes to thinking about how you enable people to move ahead. George Gilder and Tom Sowell and others ask a fundamental question. What is the difference between us today and people of the Stone Age? Same planet, same human body, same resources, same appetites. The difference is we know more. Even if there's great physical destruction, natural, war, whatever the source, if knowledge is not destroyed, we can recover and move ahead. And new knowledge only comes from freedom to experiment. If you can't experiment in the marketplace or the laboratory, new knowledge will not come into existence. Liberty unleashes human creativity. Liberty also enables us to preserve existing knowledge and prevent today's barbarians from sinking us into a new dark age, as they're trying to do on campuses and now on the workforce. So, Students for Liberty, thank you for what you are doing, and fortified with the sense of what is right, what you will continue to do. So join me in a toast to Students for Liberty, our hope for the present and for the future. Thank you. That's one nice thing about being asked to give the toast. The drink is free. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you to everyone that is here tonight. I'm going to say the words that I know is going to make everyone very happy. This concludes our dinner program. The reception is starting right outside, and the bar is open. Thank you all.